Dexter Holt and Laurel Everett met in the fall of 2005 at the Chicago Police Academy. Both were fresh recruits, eager to start their careers in law enforcement. Dexter, a natural leader, quickly distinguished himself in their cohort. He had grown up in a rough neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, and his drive to become a detective was motivated by a desire to protect others from the kind of violence and crime that had shaped his own upbringing. Laurel, originally from a small town in Wisconsin, had always dreamed of working in law enforcement. She was drawn to the idea of serving her community, bringing justice to those who had been wronged, and upholding the law. Their connection was almost immediate. Laurel admired Dexter's strong sense of duty and calm demeanor under pressure. Dexter, in turn, found Laurel's intelligence and determination compelling. They became close during their training, spending long hours studying together for exams, practicing drills, and running simulations. It wasn't long before their professional relationship turned into something more personal. After graduating from the academy in 2006, Dexter and Laurel joined the Chicago Police Department, though their paths diverged professionally. Dexter was assigned to a precinct in the West Side, an area notorious for its high crime rates. His natural aptitude for solving cases quickly caught the attention of his superiors, and within a few years, he was promoted to the homicide unit as a detective. Laurel, on the other hand, took a different path. While she enjoyed her time in uniform, she found herself drawn more to the idea of creating a stable family life. The work-life balance in law enforcement was tough, and after long discussions with Dexter, she decided to leave the police force and dedicate herself to raising a family. In 2008, Dexter and Laurel married in a small, private ceremony attended by close family and friends. Their relationship, strengthened by the mutual respect and shared values they had developed in the academy, felt unshakable. Laurel supported Dexter's demanding career, understanding the long hours and emotional toll that came with being a homicide detective. She took on the role of homemaker and soon became pregnant with their first child. In the summer of 2009, their daughter Zoe was born. Dexter, although consumed by his work, found immense joy in becoming a father. Zoe's arrival brought a sense of completeness to their lives, at least on the surface. Dexter was fully committed to his job, but always made time for his family. Laurel, meanwhile, flourished in her role as a mother, embracing the challenge of raising a child with the same dedication she once applied to her police work. As the years passed, Dexter's career continued to ascend. He became known for his methodical approach to solving cases, earning the respect of his peers and superiors alike. His work in the homicide unit led to the resolution of several high-profile cases, further cementing his reputation as one of the department's most promising detectives. The pressure was intense, but Dexter thrived in it. Laurel's unwavering support at home allowed him to focus entirely on his work, and their family life seemed ideal. Despite his growing success, Dexter remained grounded. He had never lost sight of his original goal: to protect and serve his community. For him, being a detective wasn't just a job, it was a calling. His daily work brought him face to face with the harsh realities of life in Chicago: the gang violence, the murders, the families torn apart by crime. But each case he solved felt like a small victory against the darkness that loomed over the city. And with each victory, he returned home to his wife and daughter, reminded of what he was fighting for. By 2013, Dexter was being considered for a leadership position within the homicide unit. His superiors saw in him the qualities of a future captain, someone who could lead others with the same level of dedication and professionalism that had defined his career thus far. Laurel, though increasingly isolated from the world of law enforcement, remained his biggest supporter. She had given up her own career to support Dexter's, but she believed in what he was doing. Their life, at least outwardly, appeared perfect. However, underneath the surface, small cracks were beginning to form. Dexter's long hours at work, the emotional toll of the cases he handled, and the stress of living up to the expectations placed upon him began to weigh heavily on their marriage. Laurel, though devoted to their family, started to feel the strain of raising Zoe mostly on her own. Her world had become increasingly small, revolving around their home and their daughter, while Dexter's life was consumed by the endless demands of his career. Though they rarely spoke about it, Both Dexter and Laurel were aware of the growing distance between them. Dexter tried to be present when he was home, but his mind was often preoccupied with his work. Laurel, meanwhile, tried to maintain the image of a happy family, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss for the life she had left behind. The vibrant, ambitious woman, who had once dreamed of a career in law enforcement, had now become a full-time homemaker, her world limited to the walls of their home. Still, the couple pushed forward, believing that they could weather the challenges they faced. They had been through so much together: the academy, the early years of marriage, the birth of their daughter. But as Dexter's career continued to rise, and Laurel's role at home became more isolating, they both began to realize that the path they were on might not be as straightforward as they once thought. The foundation of their marriage, built on mutual respect and shared dreams, was beginning to shift in ways neither of them fully understood. In the spring of 2014, the Chicago Police Department held its annual charity gala, an event designed to raise funds for community outreach programs and honor the officers who had gone above and beyond in their service. It was a prestigious affair, attended by high-ranking officials, prominent figures from the city's political sphere, and select members of the department's top detectives. For many, it was also a rare chance to relax and socialize outside the often grim and demanding realities of police work. Dexter, now a well-respected detective in the homicide unit, was one of the honored guests at the event. His hard work and reputation for solving some of the city's most complex murder cases had earned him recognition, and his wife Laurel accompanied him to the gala. Despite the formal setting, Dexter couldn't help but bring his work mindset into the evening. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the details of a difficult ongoing investigation, and though he made an effort to engage with others, his demeanor remained distant. Laurel, on the other hand, was eager to enjoy the night. She hadn't attended many department functions in recent years, as Dexter's increasing workload kept him busy and often away from home. But tonight was different. For once, they were out together, surrounded by the buzz of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the polished elegance of the evening. It was a welcome distraction from the monotony of her daily routine at home. As Dexter mingled with colleagues and superiors, Laurel found herself seated at a table with unfamiliar faces. That's when she met Reeves Thornton. Captain Reeves Thornton was a commanding presence in the room, a man who naturally drew attention wherever he went. At 43, he was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had long since mastered the art of leadership. As the captain of the homicide unit, he was Dexter's direct superior, though the two rarely interacted outside of formal work settings. Thornton was widely respected within the department for his strategic mind and ability to navigate the political complexities of the job. But beyond his professional acumen, he was also known for his charisma, a man who could charm anyone he met. Thornton noticed Laurel almost immediately. Sitting across the room, she stood out with her quiet elegance, a stark contrast to the bustling activity around her. As the evening progressed, their paths inevitably crossed. Thornton introduced himself, and their conversation began with polite small talk about Dexter's work, the gala, and life in Chicago. But it quickly evolved into something more personal. Thornton was captivated by Laurel's intelligence and wit, qualities that had once drawn Dexter to her as well. She, in turn, found herself drawn to the captain's magnetic personality. Unlike Dexter, who had become increasingly consumed by the weight of his responsibilities, Thornton exuded a sense of power and control that she found intoxicating. He spoke with ease and confidence, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the night went on, Laurel found herself spending more time with Thornton than with her own husband. Dexter, preoccupied with networking and discussing cases with other detectives, didn't seem to notice. Laurel couldn't help but be struck by the irony of the situation. Here she was, the wife of a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, and yet she was becoming increasingly intrigued by someone who represented a far more complex side of the system. A man whose authority and influence extended well beyond the bounds of his official rank. By the end of the evening, Laurel and Thornton had exchanged phone numbers under the pretext of keeping in touch for department-related events. But both of them knew there was something more unspoken in their interaction, an underlying current of attraction that neither could deny. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a spark that, once ignited, would be difficult to extinguish. The following weeks were a blur for Laurel. She found herself thinking about Thornton more often than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just his physical presence that drew her in. It was the idea of him, the power he wielded, the respect he commanded, and the way he made her feel alive in a world that had become increasingly small and suffocating. For years, she had dedicated herself to being the perfect wife and mother, supporting Dexter's career while setting aside her own ambitions. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of a desire for something more, something beyond the walls of her home and the role she had been playing. Thornton, for his part, didn't waste time. He began calling and texting Laurel, their conversations quickly evolving from casual exchanges to something more personal. He confided in her about the pressures of his position, the challenges of managing a department rife with internal politics, and his own sense of isolation at the top. In return, Laurel shared her frustrations about her life, her marriage, and the growing distance between her and Dexter. Thornton understood in a way that Dexter never seemed to. He made her feel heard, valued, and, perhaps most dangerously, desired. It wasn't long before their relationship crossed the line from emotional connection to physical intimacy. What had started as an innocent conversation at a gala now blossomed into a full-blown affair, hidden from the world, but simmering with intensity. Laurel knew the risks she was taking. She understood that if Dexter ever found out, it would destroy not only their marriage, but also their family. And yet, the allure of Thornton's power, combined with her own dissatisfaction at home, made it impossible for her to pull away. For Thornton, the affair was equally complicated. He was a man who thrived on control, and the idea of having an affair with the wife of one of his best detectives fed into his ego. But as their relationship deepened, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing fling. He was drawn to Laurel in ways he hadn't anticipated, and though he knew the dangers of continuing the affair, he found himself unable to stop. For the next 8 years, Laurel Everett lived a life defined by deception. On the surface, she maintained the image of a devoted wife and mother, while beneath it, she juggled the complexities of her affair with Captain Reeves Thornton. Dexter, fully absorbed by his role as a homicide detective, remained unaware of the secret life his wife was leading. The increasing demands of his job allowed Laurel to conceal the affair, and as the years passed, the lies became a natural part of her existence. Between 2014 and 2022, Laurel and Dexter's family grew. Laurel gave birth to 5 more children, convincing Dexter that he was the father of each one. The birth of each child strengthened Dexter's bond with his family, and he took great pride in being a father. He cherished his role, believing that despite the long hours and difficult cases, he had a stable, loving home to return to. Laurel played the role of the perfect wife, orchestrating a life that kept Dexter's suspicions at bay. The children, all of whom bore a resemblance to both Dexter and Laurel, only deepened Dexter's belief in his family's cohesion. He had no reason to question their parentage. Laurel, ever careful, ensured that the children called Dexter Dad, and never mentioned Thornton, who remained a shadowy presence in her life. Thornton, despite his involvement with Laurel, kept a safe distance from the children, avoiding any personal entanglements that could threaten his position. As the years went by, the affair with Thornton became more difficult to manage. What had once been a passionate and thrilling escape for both of them gradually turned into a source of tension. Laurel's demands grew. She had sacrificed so much to maintain the affair, including the stability of her own family. As the mother of 6 children, she longed for more commitment from Thornton. However, Thornton, ever the pragmatist, had no interest in upending his career for the sake of their relationship. His ambition within the police department remained his primary focus, and the thought of being publicly associated with the scandal of an affair with a subordinate's wife was unthinkable. For Thornton, the relationship had always been about control. Control over his career, control over his private life, and even, to an extent, control over Laurel. He had no intention of abandoning the power and influence he had spent decades building. His position as captain of the homicide unit afforded him privileges and opportunities that he was unwilling to jeopardize. Laurel, however, began to feel more like an inconvenience to him than a partner. He didn't want to raise children with her, let alone publicly acknowledge their relationship. To him, The affair had served its purpose. It had given him excitement and emotional escape when needed. But it was not something he ever intended to legitimize. By 2020, the dynamic between them had shifted. Laurel, now deeply entangled in the consequences of her choices, began to push Thornton for more. She wanted him to leave his wife, to commit to their relationship fully, and to acknowledge their children. She had spent nearly a decade keeping their affair secret, but she was tired of living a lie. For her, the stakes were higher. She had built her entire life around this relationship, sacrificing her integrity and honesty with her family. But Thornton resisted. He was not willing to trade his position of authority and respect within the department for a relationship that, in his eyes, had always been rooted in secrecy. His reluctance to make any serious changes in his life created a growing rift between them. Laurel, once content with their secret meetings and hidden conversations, began to resent his detachment. Thornton's refusal to acknowledge their children and the future they could have had together left her feeling abandoned and used. Meanwhile, Dexter remained oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface of his home life. His career continued to thrive, and with each new promotion, he grew more confident in his role as both a detective and a father. His devotion to his family was absolute, and he believed that, despite the stresses of his job, he had provided a stable, loving environment for his wife and children. He had no reason to suspect otherwise. Laurel had been careful to maintain the illusion of a strong, unified family. But behind closed doors, Laurel was struggling. The weight of her lies, the constant deception, and the emotional strain of her relationship with Thornton began to take a toll on her. She was no longer the woman she had been when the affair started. The secrecy, once exhilarating, now felt suffocating. She was trapped in a web of her own making, unable to extricate herself without destroying everything she had worked to build: her marriage, her children's lives, and her own sense of identity. By 2022, the strain between Laurel and Thornton had reached a breaking point. Their once passionate affair had devolved into bitter arguments and emotional distance. Laurel accused Thornton of using her, of stringing her along for years without ever intending to follow through on his promises. Thornton, in turn, accused Laurel of being too demanding, of trying to push him into a corner where he had to choose between her and his career. He had no intention of leaving his position within the department, and he made it clear that any public acknowledgement of their affair would spell disaster for both of them. Laurel's frustration grew. She had spent years crafting a delicate balance between her family life and her affair with Thornton, and now that balance was crumbling. She had believed, naively, that Thornton would eventually choose her, that he would see the value in the life they could build together. But his refusal to commit fully to their relationship shattered any remaining illusions she had about their future. At home, Dexter began to notice subtle changes in Laurel's behavior. She was more distant, more withdrawn, and more irritable than she had been in the past. He attributed it to the pressures of raising 6 children and managing the household, never once suspecting that there was something more sinister at play. He trusted Laurel implicitly, and that trust was the very foundation upon which she had built her web of lies. For Laurel, the guilt and frustration became unbearable. She had spent nearly a decade living a double life, convincing herself that she could manage both worlds without consequence. But now, as her relationship with Thornton deteriorated, and her lies grew more difficult to sustain, she realized that she was trapped. The life she had created, a life built on deception and betrayal, was beginning to unravel, and there was no easy way out. By 2022, Dexter Holt's life had become a paradox. Outwardly, he was a decorated homicide detective at the peak of his career, admired for his ability to solve some of Chicago's most intricate and brutal murder cases. His reputation as a sharp, methodical investigator had been solidified over years of relentless dedication. But at home, the world he believed to be solid, the loving family he thought he had built with Laurel, was beginning to show signs of strain. Dexter had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to notice subtle shifts in behavior that could hint at deeper truths. It was a skill he had honed over years of interviewing suspects and witnesses, picking up on small tells that others might miss. But what Dexter hadn't expected was that these same skills would lead him to question his own life, the people he loved most, and the very foundation of his family. It started with small inconsistencies, Laurel had become increasingly distant, her behavior erratic in ways Dexter couldn't quite place. He noticed her growing irritability, her frequent absences from family events, and the way she seemed to avoid spending time with him, even when he made an effort to connect. These changes in her demeanor were subtle, but they raised alarms in Dexter's mind. As a detective, he had learned to trust his instincts, and something about Laurel's recent behavior didn't sit right with him. More troubling than Laurel's distance, however, were the nagging doubts Dexter had begun to harbor about their children. Over the years, Dexter had never questioned their parentage. Why would he? He had always believed that the children were his, that their family was a product of the love and trust he shared with his wife. But as he spent more time at home, away from the relentless demands of his cases, Dexter began to notice something he hadn't paid attention to before. The children didn't resemble him. At first, Dexter brushed the thought aside. After all, genetics can be unpredictable, and it wasn't uncommon for children to take after one parent more than the other. But the more he looked at them, the more he studied their faces, their mannerisms, the more the differences stood out. Zoe, their eldest daughter, shared many of Dexter's traits: his dark eyes, his angular features, and even his quiet, observant nature. But the other 5 children? They seemed to take after Laurel almost exclusively, with no discernible resemblance to Dexter. It was as if his presence in their DNA had been erased. Dexter's suspicions grew, and with them came an unsettling sense of dread. He knew better than anyone that the mind could play tricks, that doubt could easily distort reality. But the detective in him couldn't ignore the evidence, no matter how much he wanted to. He began to scrutinize old family photos, comparing the children's features to his own, searching for any sign that he was imagining things. But the more he looked, the more convinced he became that something was terribly wrong. Unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something, Dexter decided to act. Without telling Laurel, he conducted a secret DNA test. It was a quiet, calculated decision, the kind he made every day in his work. He knew the risks, knew that once the results came back, there would be no going back. But Dexter needed to know the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. The test results confirmed his worst fears. Only Zoe, his eldest daughter, was biologically his. The other 5 children, the ones he had raised, loved, and believed to be his own, were not. They carried no trace of his DNA. In an instant, Dexter's entire world crumbled. The truth was undeniable, and with it came the crushing realization that his life had been built on a lie. For days, Dexter struggled to process the information. He had spent years solving murders, uncovering the darkest secrets of others, but nothing had prepared him for the betrayal that now stared him in the face. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, had deceived him in the most profound way imaginable. Not only had Laurel betrayed their marriage, but she had also taken from him the belief that the family they had built together was real. As the weight of the truth settled over him, Dexter's thoughts turned to Reeves Thornton. It didn't take long for Dexter to piece together the puzzle. Thornton, his superior at the homicide unit, had always been a commanding presence in their lives, though Dexter had never suspected that there was anything inappropriate about his relationship with Laurel. Now, with the DNA results in hand, Dexter could no longer ignore the glaringly obvious. Thornton had fathered the children. The betrayal cut deep. Thornton had not only taken advantage of his position of power, but had also violated the sanctity of Dexter's family. The man who had been his superior, his colleague, and someone he had respected, had been living a lie alongside him for years. Dexter's mind raced with questions. How long had the affair been going on? Had there ever been a time when Laurel truly loved him, or had their entire relationship been built on deception? And what would become of the children? The children who, despite not being biologically his, had grown up calling him Dad? These questions plagued Dexter, but there were no easy answers. What he did know was that his marriage, his career, and his very sense of self had been shattered by the revelations. He felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal and rage, emotions he had spent years compartmentalizing in his work. But this was different. This wasn't just another case. This was his life, his family, and it had all come crashing down around him. Dexter's thoughts turned dark as he contemplated his next move. He knew that confronting Laurel would be inevitable, but what would he say? How could he face the woman who had lied to him for so many years? And how could he confront Thornton, the man who had fathered his children behind his back? In the aftermath of discovering the devastating truth about his family, Dexter Holt carefully planned his next move. He knew that a direct confrontation was inevitable, but he also knew that he couldn't rush into it. The gravity of the situation demanded precision. His entire life had been built on solving complex cases, uncovering the truth piece by piece. Now, he had to approach his own personal crisis with the same calculated mindset, though the stakes were infinitely higher and far more personal. Dexter decided that the confrontation would take place at home. It was the place where his life with Laurel and the children had played out, the stage upon which their seemingly perfect family had performed for years. It was also the place where the lies needed to be torn apart, exposed for what they truly were. Dexter reached out to both Laurel and Reeves Thornton, requesting a meeting under the guise of needing to discuss something important, something private. He didn't reveal the details, but the weight in his voice was enough to convince them both to come. Laurel arrived first, just as Dexter had anticipated. She entered the house with an air of confusion, sensing that something was off, but not yet aware of the full scale of what was about to unfold. For years, she had hidden behind layers of deception, convincing herself that she could keep up the facade indefinitely. But as she stepped into the living room that evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dexter had finally uncovered something. Thornton arrived shortly after. His demeanor was cool, as always, but Dexter noticed a hint of unease in his posture. The captain of the homicide unit had long been accustomed to exerting control in every situation, both in his professional life and in his personal affairs. But even Thornton couldn't fully disguise the flicker of doubt that passed through his eyes as he greeted Dexter. He knew that being called to a private meeting like this, away from the office, meant that something was wrong. As the three of them sat down in the living room, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Dexter, seated opposite Laurel and Thornton, took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but now that it was happening, the emotions were more difficult to control than he had anticipated. Still, he maintained his composure. For now. "I know everything," Dexter said, his voice low but steady. The words hung in the room like a heavy cloud. Laurel's face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Thornton shifted in his seat, his expression hardening as he braced for what was coming next. "I know about the affair," Dexter continued, his gaze fixed on Laurel. "I know that only Zoe is mine. The DNA test confirmed it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Laurel's hands trembled as she tried to process the reality of Dexter's words. She had been living in denial for so long, convincing herself that the affair with Thornton could remain hidden, that the truth would never come to light. But now, the truth was staring her in the face, undeniable and inescapable. Dexter's eyes flicked to Thornton, whose jaw was clenched in an attempt to keep his composure. "I know that you're the father of the other children," Dexter said, his voice now colder, more accusatory. "And I know that you've both been lying to me for years." Laurel finally found her voice, though it was shaky. "Dexter, Why?" Dexter interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "Why did you do it, Laurel? Why did you betray me like this?" Tears welled up in Laurel's eyes as she struggled to find the words. "I never meant for it to happen like this," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to be this way." Dexter stood up, pacing the room as the weight of everything came crashing down on him. "So what was it supposed to be then?" "Huh? A life where I raise another man's children while you sneak around behind my back? How long did you think you could keep this up?" Laurel broke down, her voice barely audible through her sobs. "It wasn't like that at first. I didn't plan it, Dexter. I swear." "Then explain it to me," Dexter demanded, his eyes burning with a mixture of hurt and anger. "Explain why you chose him." Laurel hesitated, her gaze flickering between Dexter and Thornton. The truth was too heavy to bear, but there was no avoiding it now. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I chose Reeves because of who he is," she admitted. "Because of his power, his influence. He was everything you weren't, Dexter. Everything I thought I wanted. I was drawn to him because he was strong, because he could offer me something more. But—" She paused, wiping the tears from her face. "But I stayed with you because he didn't want us. He never wanted the responsibility." Dexter's eyes narrowed as he turned to Thornton, who had remained silent up until now. "Is that true?" Dexter asked, his voice laced with disdain. "You used her, then left her to clean up the mess? You never had any intention of being a part of this family, did you?" Thornton met Dexter's gaze, his expression unreadable. "It was never about family," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I have my own career to think about. I couldn't risk it. This was never part of the plan." The cold detachment in Thornton's voice sent a chill through the room. Laurel, who had once seen Thornton as a powerful, charismatic figure, now saw him for what he truly was. A man who had never cared about her or the children. A man who had used her for his own convenience and discarded her when it no longer suited him. Dexter's anger flared. "So that's it?" he spat, his fists clenched. "You get to walk away just like that? After everything you've done, after all the lies, you think you can just leave us behind?" Thornton's expression hardened. "I never asked for this, Dexter. You know how this works. We make choices. Sometimes they're the wrong ones. But I'm not going to throw away my career over a mistake." Laurel sobbed quietly in the corner, her face buried in her hands. She had been abandoned by the man she had once admired, and now she faced the devastating reality of her choices. Thornton had never intended to be part of their lives, and now he was making that abundantly clear. Dexter, overwhelmed with rage and betrayal, stood in the center of the room, his world collapsing around him. The man he had once respected, the wife he had loved, and the family he had believed in. All of it had been a lie. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. In the dimly lit living room of Dexter Holt's home, the tension reached its breaking point. The truth, now fully exposed, hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Dexter, standing in the center of the room, felt a cold, unbearable rage building within him. His world, his career, his family, his very identity, had been shattered by the revelation of Laurel's affair and the betrayal by Reeves Thornton, the man who had fathered his children. Laurel sat sobbing quietly in the corner, her face buried in her hands, while Thornton, ever composed, remained seated with a detached, almost indifferent expression. For years, Dexter had fought to bring justice to the streets of Chicago, to uncover the truth in the most brutal and complex cases. But now, his own life had become a nightmare. One with no clear solution, no easy path to resolution. In a moment of profound emotional turmoil, Dexter's mind snapped. His vision blurred. The room around him seemed to close in, and a cold, detached sense of inevitability took over. The gun, his service weapon, always by his side, was within reach. Without fully understanding what he was doing, Dexter drew the weapon from his holster. In the next instant, 2 gunshots echoed through the house. The first bullet hit Reeves Thornton in the chest. His calm expression shifted to one of shock as he slumped back in his chair, blood staining his crisp white shirt. The second shot struck Laurel, who gasped as she fell to the floor, her eyes wide with disbelief. In the span of mere seconds, Dexter had ended the lives of the 2 people who had betrayed him most. For a brief moment, there was silence. Dexter stood frozen, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. The gun fell from his hand and clattered to the floor. He couldn't process the enormity of what had just occurred, but deep down, he knew that his life, as he had known it, was over. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air. The police, alerted by neighbors who had heard the gunshots, arrived at the scene. Dexter's colleagues, men and women he had worked with for years, burst through the door and found him standing in the blood-soaked living room. Thornton and Laurel lay motionless on the floor, their lifeless bodies a testament to the rage that had consumed Dexter in that fateful moment. Dexter made no attempt to resist. He was handcuffed and led out of the house, his eyes vacant, his mind numb. His colleagues, many of whom had once admired him, now looked at him with a mix of shock, disbelief, and pity. The detective who had brought justice to so many victims was now a murderer himself. The news of the crime spread quickly, and within hours, it became a national story. The involvement of a high-ranking police officer like Thornton, combined with Dexter's respected career as a detective, made the case a media sensation. Reporters swarmed the scene, and the public was captivated by the tragic fall of a man who had once been a hero in his community. A special commission was immediately formed to investigate the incident, given the high-profile nature of the individuals involved. The fact that a respected homicide detective had killed his wife and his superior officer in cold blood required a thorough and impartial investigation. The police department, already under scrutiny for issues of corruption and misconduct, found itself thrust into the spotlight once again. As the investigation unfolded, shocking details about Reeves Thornton's career began to emerge. The media uncovered long-buried reports of corruption, abuse of power, and the manipulation of cases for personal gain. Thornton, who had once been hailed as a rising star in the department, was revealed to be deeply entrenched in the murky politics of Chicago's law enforcement system. His affair with Laurel was just one piece of a much larger web of unethical behavior. Dexter's trial, which began several months after the murders, became a national spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal experts, and members of the public, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution presented the case as a clear instance of premeditated murder, arguing that Dexter had carefully planned the confrontation and had acted with intent when he fired the fatal shots. The defense, however, focused on Dexter's emotional state at the time of the crime. His lawyer argued that Dexter had been pushed to the brink by years of betrayal, emotional manipulation, and the discovery that the children he had raised were not his own. The defense presented Dexter as a man who had been deeply traumatized, suffering from temporary insanity brought on by the overwhelming weight of the truth. They claimed that in that moment of madness, Dexter had lost control, acting not out of malice, but out of unbearable pain. Throughout the trial, Dexter remained largely silent, his once sharp analytical mind clouded by the events that had led him to this point. The man who had once prided himself on his ability to see through lies and uncover the truth was now grappling with the ultimate betrayal, both by those he loved and by his own sense of justice. In the end, the jury found Dexter guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict reflected the complexity of the case. While Dexter had acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage, the fact remained that 2 people had been killed. The court acknowledged Dexter's years of dedicated service to the city, as well as the emotional turmoil that had led to the crime. But the law required justice. The judge, taking into account Dexter's clean record and the extenuating circumstances, sentenced him to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. It was a harsh sentence, but one that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the compassion for a man who had been driven to commit an unthinkable act. As Dexter was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his actions finally settled in. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but in the end, it was justice that had caught up with him. He would spend the next decade and a half in a federal prison, haunted by the memories of what he had lost: his family, his career, and his sense of self.